Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com.
The election of Zohran Mamdani, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, running as the Democratic Party candidate, as mayor of New York City after running a campaign advocating reforms to improve the lives of working-class people, in spite of a torrent of racist right-wing hostility funded by capitalists who are repulsed by his agenda, has grabbed the attention of many people around the world who are hungry for change and an alternative to the rise of the far right. The political conclusions that people on the left draw from his win will affect the left not just in the US, but internationally. How the left in New York City acts in relation to the Mamdani administration will also have an influence on the left across the US and potentially beyond. So on this episode, I'm happy to be joined by two socialists in New York City to discuss all this and more. Could you introduce yourselves to listeners?
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. I'm Robert Cuffy. I'm here in New York City. I work for the city of New York, and I'm also a member of the DC 37 Union Federation, and I'm in Local 371, which is the Social Service Employees Union. I'm also a delegate on the worksite. I'm also involved in a couple of mutual aid abolitionist collectives in the city, Washington Square Park Mutual Aid and Black Voices Matter. Thanks for having me.
And I'm Sherry Wolf. I'm a longtime socialist. I'm a member of the Tempest Collective and Jewish Voice for Peace. Here in New York City, bunch of other organizations doing Ice Watch, blah, blah, blah. And I work as the senior organizer at Rutgers of the Faculty, Grad, and Postdoc Union, which is the State University of New Jersey. It's a Research One institution. So I'm a union organizer by trade.
Thanks to both of you for joining us. So can you start with telling listeners what the impact of Mamdani's win has been in New York City, as you see it?
Why don't you go for it, Sher?
Oh, you want me kicking off? All right, Robert. I guess I'd say emotionally and politically, certainly Mamdani's victory has transformed progressives and the broad left in New York City into a more hopeful and energetic force than in the past few years of genocide and the rise or re-rise of Trumpism. And so I think in a time of pretty deep despair and dissembling from the relentless attacks in the first year of Trump 2.0, I guess we're calling it, a lot of leftists were really disengaging or even, I would say, politically paralyzed and exhausted in the early months. And Mamdani's primary win last June created a sort of that was created itself. It was a reflection, I think, of a pretty impressive ground game of canvassing. At that point, I think about 50,000 people had participated. And since then, to get him to over the top as to win the mayoralty, another 50,000 or so. We're knocking on doors. They claim some 2 million doors were knocked on. I can believe it, living here in New York and being in the neighborhood. And if anybody was out and about on a Saturday or a Sunday, you saw groups of 20 or 30 people caucusing to either assess or prepare to go out and canvass. It was notable in many, many neighborhoods. My neighborhood, I think, voted 80% for Mamdani. I live in Brooklyn, just south of the park, Flatbush, Ditmas area. It's a large Bangladeshi and Haitian immigrant neighborhood, as well as a number of progressive whites and other and Black African Americans. And I think that Mamdani's sort of victory kind of inspired a lot more people some of whom maybe had organized in the past, maybe got re-engaged within a week or so of his victory. 750 people, I noticed, participated in online training to build an organizing campaign to fight for his agenda. Free childcare and fast and free buses and that whole program that he ran on that most people could sort of cite from memory as they went into the polls. This initiative is called Our Time. We'll talk about it a little bit more. But I think that, and hundreds of people, in fact, that first weekend got out and hit the doors, and I was among them, to see and participate in that effort. I think, and Robert can probably speak more knowledgeably than I think DSA has now grown to the largest size it's ever been, 80,000. I am not a member. But in some, I'd say that there's an air of possibility here expressed through sort of stepped up organizing, despite the sort of grim drumbeat of repression. Especially, we're having this conversation now the day after Alex Pretty was executed by ICE agents. That's in Minnesota, leading to yet another eruption and outburst of rage. I think the mood politically, and from what I can see in the early stages, is more hopeful here, perhaps because people feel they can breathe. There's an opening, and that is real.
Yeah, I think similarly, there has been a transformation in people's expectations as to what they can get out of the electoral process. I think a lot before Zohran, there was like a lot of cynicism amongst people regarding the electoral process. I think looking at the election of a mayor like de Blasio, who was in power before Eric Adams, and de Blasio's pretty much leftist profile, like his political enemies, for example, derided him as a Marxist. And I think at some point he himself was a member of the DSA. But, there were at the time, I would say, like in what's called the Commie Corridor in Brooklyn, in the area that's like heavily gentrified, where a lot of young people who are actively involved in politics were kind of hope and belief that, at least on the national stage, by backing folks like Bernie Sanders, that you could make a difference. I think what Zohran's campaign did was really widen that social layer of people to folks who typically were not involved in electoral politics before, who kind of saw an opening to speak to their neighbors about the affordability agenda that Zohran put on the table, which was, a pretty bold thing to do in the political atmosphere of the United States. And I think it's obviously the sensible thing to do. But given the constraints that the Democratic Party political machine in New York City and New York State has put on politics, where they pretty much tried to not be too risky, I think the election of Adams is a consequence of that. We had this de Blasio guy who was trying to do something a little bit populist, so we need to go back to the establishment. And I think populist politics is kind of what's winning out in the United States currently, like Trump's right-wing populism, Zohran's left-wing populism, the kind of populism that actually acknowledges there's a problem, right? That people are hurting, things are not good, and that coupling that acknowledgement with putting forward bold proposals like taxing the rich, free childcare, free buses, actually got people hopeful enough that, this is a system we can use to change. And of course, DSA and other leftist organizations had been doing so much groundwork electorally and in other places to make the moment possible that folks started, like my coworkers who would look at me like a devil with two horns on my head if I talked about socialism in like 2010. In 2025, I didn't have to talk to them about Zohran. They were talking to me about Zohran.
So any thoughts on the impact of his election, not just in New York City, but looking more broadly across the U.S. at this time when, the far-right Trump administration is on the rampage?
I mean, I think, look, the starting point for me is, people without hope don't tend to fight back. So I start with acknowledging that morale has lifted and that matters. But that can also be fleeting, okay? In some ways, I feel like I've been here before and I've seen some of this before, even though the context is different and the individual is obviously an earnest and fascinating man. I think in my own union and in the AFL-CIO generally, there are more trade union members signing up to learn how to run for local office than I can recall at any time. These are often some of the most consistent union activists who see pivoting to electoral runs on the Democratic Party line as Democrats, as an extension or even an amplification of their union militancy. And I am, in all honesty, concerned about that. And I see it even, right now as people, even right now I work in Jersey, I live in Brooklyn, and, there's ICE in the big cities in Jersey as well. And a lot of the organizing has been very much around the local electoral, efforts, the gubernatorial race that happened this year, stuff like that. And there's been less robust organizing, in fact, against, what is happening on the ground than there probably would be. And I look at that, with, an eye toward, a certain fear about what could be happening as the electoral stuff takes over people's imaginations about what's possible. And I think that since the national rise of, Bernie in 2016 and the 2017 victory of AOC and, Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, we've seen a kind of rise in hopes that social democrats running as Democrats on the Democratic Party line can potentially reposition the party. Or at least alleviate the worst. Whether they run as members of the DSA or not, to me, seems to many people often irrelevant or unknown. But the victory of the people who make unapologetic left-wing speeches and demands is perceived as proof that the left may actually be able to reposition the party or a significant section of the party. And so I kind of feel like Mamdani's victory for now has validated that position for people who believe that. And even the debates that had existed a decade ago around whether or not the role of socialists inside the Democratic Party should be to try and go in there and in order to have a dirty break at some point, as a term that was coined, I think, by Eric Blanc, who works at Rutgers, or once you get a sufficient number of electeds in office, or to build a surrogate party operating as a sort of caucus within the Democratic Party. All of those debates have frankly disappeared, or been forgotten from what I can tell. Maybe they exist within DSA in a way that isn't amplified beyond its ranks, but I don't hear that. That's not what I see echoed, in the pages of Jacobin or, online. I think that there is a sort of creeping sense of, electoralism will save us, and the Democratic Party it seems to more and more people as a movable force right now, even at the same time that they look on the national stage at Congress, and where we seem to have no more legislative branch in this country. We've got an executive branch and a judicial branch and a disappeared legislative branch. So I think both of these things are existing side by side in people's minds, both, a deep hope out of the Mamdani victory that we can elect our way into moving this party into a different direction, and yet deep despair at the national level at the utter, what's at best paralysis and at worst collusion of the federal Democrats in the fuckery that Trump is imposing across the country. I mean, after all, what is their demand right now? It's to sort of, retrain and rein in ICE, not abolish ICE, not get rid of this institution of slave catchers and Gestapo agents, but to sort of reconfigure them. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, I think the Democratic Party establishment is at a crossroads, and they're facing this conundrum, as Sherry indicates. But to go back to the question of what the national implications are, I think what it shows is that to some extent, at least on a local level, state and city level, it is possible to push the Democratic Party establishment to the left and to do things it kind of doesn't want to do. But it's definitely a push and pull, right? So I remember in DSA and the other organizations' first attempt to tax the rich, that where that campaign happened in 2021. That was around the same time DSA and other left-wing organizations won the elimination of cash bail in New York. But what it required was the the DSA members who were part of the state legislature actually supporting that year's budget. And an article came out and they said, they were forced to do so. Their hands were tied behind their backs, pretty much what happened is that the undocumented workers fund that they won and the elimination of cash bail was tied to them supporting what was otherwise an austerity budget, and not winning tax the rich, because the demands they put in place for the bills to be passed for tax the rich, governor at the time did not pass them. And to just win these small demands, they had to go along with it. But on the other hand, we've also seen a transformation of the Democratic Party in New York State, where, maybe a decade ago, we had this thing called the IDC, the Independent Democratic Caucus, of Democrats who openly caucus with Republicans in the state, which is ridiculous because it's a majority Democrat state, right? But part of the organizing to elect AOC and State Senator Julia Salazar was the destruction of that Independent Democratic Caucus. And part of the struggle to then elect various DSA members like Jabari Brisport and others who serve in the state legislature was a fight against the machine of the Democratic Party in New York City and New York State. And in some ways fighting even against like the established Black political machine in the state. So it's come to this conundrum now where previously, DSA was able to kind of go into these districts where the Democratic Party took their electorate for granted and do the organizing Sherry talked about, where people actually, felt motivated enough to go talk to their neighbors, knock on doors, and actually build turnout for the election to the point that DSA was able to win. Whereas now the Democratic Party machine is aware of DSA's tactics and works boldly to get rid of them. So in my union, for example, DC 37, which was previously in love with Eric Adams, my union president, Henry Garita, I believe, was one of the people who went to the Dominican Republic to celebrate Eric Adams' victory with him. They were kind of left stuck about what to do once Eric Adams was not a viable candidate for mayor anymore because of the various scandals he was involved in. And even though it was clear that Zohran was the Labor candidate, right? They came up with their own schemes that they manufactured in some ways the candidacy of Adrian Adams as Speaker of the City Council, just so they could have someone who's not Zohran to back. But on the other hand, organizing within the union from DSA members and other people like myself was so strong, and Zohran's performance in the DC 37 mayoral debate was so strong that they had to endorse him. And it comes to the point that, like, my locals president, Anthony Wells, during our last delegate retreat, he was like, we're going to endorse the guy. He couldn't even say Zohran's name. And then he continually mispronounced Zohran's name. But, it's kind of something they were forced to do because this is where the tide of the struggle is. And I think on a national scale, the implications there are that it is possible, right, that if the Democratic Party tacks left, they can come out with electoral victories. But that would require that part of the Democratic Party coalition, which is like these unions and other left-wing organizations, actually have influence within the Democratic Party on a national level. And we've seen that every time this kind of left populist rhetoric and legislation comes up, the Democratic Party establishment has moved swiftly to kill it, right? Like they've even dragged Bernie himself back to the establishment and back to the right on many significant issues. Whereas if you look at the Republican Party, they've gone wholeheartedly with right-wing populism to the point it might be, right-wing fascism at this point, depending on how you analyze Trumpism. So I think the thing is the Republicans have been okay with Trumpism taking over their party. The Democrats would not be okay with Zohranism taking over the party. On a national level, they won't bow to reality, which is that, you have to A, acknowledge the actual and real suffering of people, and B, put forward bold proposals because, as Sherry alluded to, there are people who don't explicitly think about it or implicitly believe that you can move the Democrats towards a position where you can govern in the interest of working class people. But the Democratic Party at the end of the day is a party of capital, right? So while left-wing members in their coalition might say things like abolish ICE, the most they could do is say, bring back the INS, Immigration and Nationalization Service, that existed prior to 9/11 when they created the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. But, even under the INS, right, like people got deported, there was a government agency around. But I think what people want in many ways is a return to the political order that they know. Even if that political order is like in many ways facetious and not real, it actually included things like respect for the rule of law. Whereas now we have Trumpism in power, which was like, well, if you don't like it, sue me. take it to the Supreme Court. Oh, guess what? I have the Supreme Court stacked. So I think part of it is that people who are for the first time kind of involved in a process of their own political development and their consciousness is becoming aware, they're not necessarily asking the questions, well, can we move the Democratic Party to the left? They're just asking the question, what can we do to stop the tide of Trumpism? And all the things that can be done, the Democratic Party establishment in many ways on a national level is stopping people. And I think what New York City shows is that if you do a patient long haul of organizing that the DSA has done over the last 10 years, you can at least get to the point where you elect someone like Zohran. But then, if you look in fine detail at Zohran's administration, you'll see that even on the campaign trail, he had to start to tack right. And as soon as he got elected, he had to go even farther. And I think, at least for me, as a Black person living in New York City, who's gotten himself arrested in like a lot of anti-police actions, the most glaring example of that is him keeping the current police commissioner, Tish, who's a scion of a billionaire family, among very many other things.
Thanks both. I'd like to move us, soon to looking forward. But before we look forward, I think we need to look back just a little bit. And you've touched on this, but if you could say a little more about when you analyze what made Mamdani's win possible, because I think it's not well understood necessarily. Can you talk a little bit more about what you think actually made this outcome possible?
I think the media and much of the left, to be honest, focus a great deal on Mamdani's undoubtedly winning personality, his charm, his attractiveness, his compelling social media chops. All of those things are just sort of irrefutable, but not sufficient, in my opinion. I think his victory in large part is a reflection of a political radicalization that traces back to even 2008, the financial crisis, which came to a head at Occupy, right, in 2011, and exploded over the last decade plus with Black Lives Matter, movement and various iterations of it really since 2013 when Trayvon Martin was killed, through, George Floyd uprising of 2020 when a reported 26 million, hit the streets. And then, of course, I think the response to the genocide in Gaza since 23, helped sow that ground. I think Mamdani's ability to overcome a massively funded ruling class and Zionist smear campaign against who is the first Muslim mayor, really speaks volumes. A brown man born in Africa, after all, it speaks volumes about the shift in popular consciousness around Palestine and race generally. And I think that the intrepid efforts of Palestine Youth Movement and JVP and Jewish Voice for Peace and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and Within Our Lifetime and Party for Socialism and Liberation and DSA and Tempest and all of these other comrades who've been out there organizing week after week since the genocide began, I think made it possible for Mamdani to hold an unapologetic pro-Palestine and anti-genocide position in a city with 1.5 million Jews and 800,000 Muslims. I think in some ways Occupy, Black Lives Matter, and Gaza went to the polls in the Mamdani campaign. I think that context and history matter more than the individual attributes of the candidate in many key ways, as crucial and undeniable as those winning attributes are.
Yeah, I think 2008 is a significant thing to talk about because what has been happening, I agree with Cherry that a lot of the people who've been protesting in many ways dragged a wider layer of people with them to the polls. But I think capitalism in itself has just been hurting working class people in the United States to an extent it hasn't in previous decades and previous generations, and typified by the subprime mortgage crisis that was behind the 2008 financial collapse. And in the same way that subprime mortgage crisis fell hardest on the backs of Black and brown people in the working class, the ongoing austerity attacks that came through the COVID crisis and other things had similar effects. And I think people, like I said before, the acknowledgement of this, as well as Zohran's bold declaration of policies to fight against it, brought a wider layer of people to the poll and made it so that, they turned out and voted. And I think, for people who take it for granted, right, like the number of people who have turned out to the polls in the United States in the last decade or so has been steadily trickling up. Unlike other places like Indonesia or even Guyana, where I'm from, where elections, especially national elections, are like a big thing. They're a cause for celebration. Like I remember growing up in Guyana, and when there was a national election, whenever someone went to vote, the way they verified that they voted was to ink their thumb, right? And your ink thumb was something to show off that you participated in this political process. And it's only very recently I've seen this kind of pride in participation in the electoral system in New York City. Like people would walk around with their I voted stickers or the free pen you get from the polling center. And it's this real transformation that people are saying, whereas they were previously cynical about the ability of the political system to bring about change, now they're more invested. And I myself have been someone who's been very cynical. Like the real first canvassing I did was for Kamala Harris's campaign, because at one point, it was my belief that we had to keep Trump out by any means. And I was like, well, let me just stop saying this and actually go do some canvassing. So I went with my union. They packed a bus full of us and they took us to Philadelphia, which was because Pennsylvania was one of the swing states, to go knock doors there in support of Harris's campaign. And that was in many ways eye-opening, like the lukewarm, tepid response that we got from people. Some people just didn't want to open their doors. And if they did, they're like, yeah, I'm already voting for her if I have to. And a lot of these people in Philly had pro-Palestine stuff in their window, and they understood the contradiction that was facing them, which is that, we want to get rid of Trump, but what really is the Democratic Party offering us? And I think Zohran kind of answers that question, at least on the citywide level. What is the Democratic Party offering us? What is this particular candidate offering us? And he's offering a direct challenge to the establishment, in the same way that Jesus threatened to throw the moneylenders out the temple. Zohran and Trump are threatening the establishment that way. They're coming in to drain the swamp and clean things up and put a new order in place so that you, the everyday person, can see yourself and feel yourself in these halls of power. And I think that's a powerful message for people who otherwise have been facing these relentless attacks, but also in some ways fighting back and gaining a sense of power. And I think it's a very dangerous thing happening, because personally, I don't think Zohran can necessarily fulfill those campaign promises that he's made outside of an active fight back of working class people. But Zohran also has to navigate this coalition he's built of the big businesses, the union leaders, and then the more leftist part of his base, like the DSA. So it's going to be a very interesting administration to follow.
Well, this moves me exactly to the next thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is what obstacles you see facing him in achieving the policy agenda that he's staked out, and what do you think it would actually take to win the reforms that he campaigned for?
I mean, New York City is the financial capital of a declining empire. That seems to me the starting point for talking about the obstacles. Wall Street, and the entire, ruling class of the United States that seems to be headquartered, or at least has intellectually and ideologically headquartered at Wall Street, has a stake in what happens in this town. Because it's also the center of the media, or one of the big centers of media in this country. And so whatever happens here, not simply because it's 9 million people, but because the, sort of outside attention that is on it, gets amplified, and either good or bad can spread from here more easily. And I think really the entirety of the Democratic Party establishment, and the governor of the state, the chief executive of the state, Kathy Hochul, is nobody's idea of a radical. I mean, she was literally, her endorsement of Mamdani was like the lowest bar of endorsement a human being can have. She's like, yeah, okay, I guess I got to be with this guy. I mean, it was painful. You could see she was wincing at having been forced kicking and screaming to even do anything. What that will mean in terms of what she will do, I don't believe there's any stomach. Plus, this is an election year, has any stomach for standing up against Trump. The city's budget is $116 billion or so in itself, even though only 6 or 7% of the budget, as my understanding, comes directly from the feds. That can be very misleading because, of course, there's all sorts of fuckery that the federal government can impose on a state in terms of its funding sources that may not be direct line to the state, but has implications on healthcare, on education, on sanitation, on every goddamn thing that happens. Not least of which, the fact that we have a city in which, running on a 19th century transit system that has never really been upgraded since really. I mean, if you ever look at the guts of that subway, and I have occasionally had reason to be brought back there, the guts of it is still literally from my childhood, from 50, 60 years ago. It looks like, it's terrifying, the technology that moves millions of people around the city. We can't even get a second tunnel dug between connecting, New York City, after all, is an archipelago of islands, not connected to the mainland of the country, except through a tunnel to Jersey that everybody has to get, sit in a train behind cargo that has first priority over humans trying to go between the mainland of the United States and the city of New York. So there's all sorts of things that the federal government can do. And I think that we also, setting that aside, I think also we do not yet have. I'm really gratified to see that many of the forces involved, including many of my comrades in JVP and Jewish Voice for Peace, who threw down for Mamdani and played an active role, seeing the need to pivot towards organizing working class people, regular people, ordinary people in the neighborhoods at the ground level in order to win any of these things. But that doesn't mean that people are heeding that call in large numbers, or even necessarily understand or have a clear picture of what that looks like and how to do it. Because after all, with the evisceration of civil society organizations and left groupings over these last decades, there's a really impoverished understanding of what organizing, self-organization, member-led organization, building cadre, right, leadership that knows how to read a room, shift a room, get people to, gather people behind an initiative, inspire people, listen to people, and reflect, and all the rest of that. We don't really have that. So people are talking about, and I'm glad for this, and this is a change. This is a change from, AOC and Bernie and the prior elected runs, that there is a sort of more immediate and serious pivot to organizing. But what that looks like on the ground and what that means and how that is translated in the minds of ordinary people is not necessarily what I may think is needed, or we may think is needed to actually win. Because just going out, for example, and canvassing as if it were an electoral project and not movement building that needs to take up debates and discussion and education, as well as move people and people moving themselves and moving their neighbors and their family members. Those are very different tasks. And I think right now, much of the pivot to organizing is sort of treating the massive success around canvassing for Mamdani as the model of what organizing needs to look like moving forward. And I don't believe at all that is anywhere near what is sufficient or necessary to build the kind of clear, united class fight back in a city where the stakes are enormous. The ruling class cannot just simply give away anything here. This is going to be, they're going to line up, and they do know how to organize their forces, and they do have gabillions of dollars behind them. So I think that as gratified and as I am to see sort of universal understanding on the broad left of the need to organize, what that actually means, what that looks like, how to do that, how to get people equally inspired and organizing after they've done a year of canvassing is is not yet there. And we're far from that, from the kinds of rich discussions, I think, that need to be had about what organizing really looks like on the ground to win this stuff. What is won right now is the idea that this needs to happen. What that looks like and what that means is a very different question.
Yeah, I think the question of power is a discussion that's had in the Democratic Socialists of America a lot. And in many ways, to be reductive, it kind of does come down to power equals getting elected. And all the other, a lot of us who've been leftists prior to the rise of the DSA have kind of been derided and criticized as just too critical. And I think one of the things that the DSA has done in response to Zohran's win is kind of like, close the doors and kind of like tighten the ship to be like, well, we're here to help Zohran. Like one of the articles that has been circulated says, we don't need to focus our attention on holding Zohran accountable. We need to focus our attention on helping him to build power. I think you obviously need one to do the other, right? I think the greatest example, at least for me, as someone employed by the city of New York, is that my citywide contract expires this year. So we'll have to negotiate for a new contract with Zohran. And that brings up the ongoing and ever-present question of austerity. And I think this is one of the things we, as socialists, need to continue to talk about, right? Because austerity is not imposed because there's bad people in power. Austerity is imposed because of the nature of the capitalist system, that it is an inherently exploitive system, and it's a system that gains profit through exploitation. But more importantly, it's a system that over the long term is not as profitable as it used to be. And to continue to build up those levels of profitability over the last few decades, what they've done is attack the standards of living of the working class. So the question is, can a Zohran Mamdani administration stop the slide, right? Can they stop the attack on the working class? But more importantly, can it go the other way? Can it move us towards a livable wage? And literally, this is something that the mayor would have the power to do through his Office of Labor Relations when, these hundreds and thousands of city workers come and say, well, hey, it's time for a contract. How about we have raises that actually keep up with inflation that has been rampant over the last few years? And how will he respond? And it's not as if, Zohran is having this conversation with like a loose collective of workers. New York City is a highly unionized city, especially the city workers. So you have these massive organizations like DC 37, the United Federation of Teachers, that will come to the door to negotiate with this mayor. So I think the outcome of that in some ways will be very indicative of like what can you actually wring from this mayoral administration. But I think beyond that, the Zohran administration also has to navigate the actual racial politics of New York City, right? I think one of the most unexpected things we saw since Zohran has been elected has been his meeting with Trump, where they were smiling and glad-handing together. And some people were like, well, this is just what it's like when there's two people from Queens in a room. But, to the extent that they're from very different parts of Queens, where Trump is from Jamaica Estates, this very gilded place that it's hard to get into, and very much homogeneously mostly white. And Zohran is from Astoria, which is, as a very blended immigrant community. At least to me, the thing that stands out about both those parts of Queens is that Black people don't live there, right? Black people in Queens are like shuttled into Southeast Queens, Jamaica, Hollis, Queens Village, and those areas. So the ever-present problem that the Democratic Socialists of America has, or it's seen, and it's largely true, that it's a majority white organization. The Democratic Party establishment uses that then to attack Zohran and attack the DSA and say, well, there's not even a Black deputy mayor. What are you guys really doing? How can you really fight for our people? So there's a lot at stake. But if we go back to the specific proposals Zohran has put forward, I think Sherry is right in saying that, he needs to get the governor and the state legislature along with him. Because if you want free buses, unfortunately, the mayor of New York does not control the transit system, the Metropolitan Transit Authority. It's run primarily through the state, and the governor would have to come down and say, okay, we need these free buses. And how do you fund the free buses? Obviously, you have to tax the rich. And we can see the governor is very much like not in favor of that and kind of froze like a deer in the headlights when she went to Zohran's inauguration ceremony and when she went to that big rally and the crowd started chanting tax the rich. But, in many ways, I think what's happening is that tax the rich would bring in the revenue needed for a lot of the programs that Zohran is saying. I think so far he's actually wrestled an agreement from Hochul to make childcare free in the city. But taxing the rich is like a bigger thing, right? Because there's these very specific bills that are being put forward to increase the amount of money that millionaires and billionaires have to pay into the state coffers. And because these millionaires and billionaires are in many ways the bedrock on which the Democratic Party stands, it's going to be a challenge as to how you get them to go along with this. Obviously, to me, if Zohran was really like taking this left populism thing by the reins, he would build his coalition and try to push it to the left and even push some of the unions that endorsed him to do more, to actually like have rallies, right? And actually have an actual movement going to say like, this is where we are. Austerity is an inevitability of this system. They want to balance the budgets, but it should not be balanced on the backs of working class people. And while there's some of that rhetoric around, because Zohran inevitably has to have a large part of the capitalist class in his coalition to run the city that is the center of world finance, we're in a, like I said before, a very tricky situation. So I think the real obstacles would be if Zohran's left populism becomes a brake on the self-organization and self-activity of the working class that has picked up in the last decade or so, and that in some ways helped to usher him into office. The tests will be coming fast and very soon, I think, with the expiration of those contracts, the ongoing push by the Trump administration to push ICE into the city, and the negotiations with both New York State and the federal government over the MTA and the state of it, and something as simple as free buses.
I wanted to say something about what Robert said. I really agree with what you said, Robert, and I want to just touch on something because you were talking about the sort of power question and all, and I've been thinking about this a lot because I feel like with many of my comrades who I work with who were heavily involved in the Mamdani campaign, there was a sense that we are in power, and and I don't buy that. And I think that therein lies the rub in a way for me. Bernie, like just 2 months, like people identify, like people are not distinguishing between rhetoric and even personal belief and what somebody does in a position of elected authority and the pulls that exist on them. I mean, it was just 2 months ago, Bernie was talking how we need borders and we need protection. And he was even praising Trump. Like, he said, it blows me away sometimes when I even read it. It's like, if you don't have borders, you don't have a nation, he said. Trump did a better job. I don't like Trump, but we should have a secure border. It ain't that hard to do. Biden didn't do it. In other words, like, I'm not trying to conflate one with the other, but like Mamdani with Bernie, but like what happens when you're in this, you buy into the logic of the state and protecting its borders. Now, has Mamdani done that yet? No, but he is bought into the logic of the state needs to have a strong police, and we need to, I need certain other things from people in positions of power, so I better hands off on somebody who's abused that power at the head of the police department, Tish, and therefore she is going to remain as the head of my police. I mean, if you look at, and there's not a very good history of sort of giving a pass on electeds, who basically, the Jamal Bowman affair, if you will, who was challenged by members, a left-wing DSA or African-American in office, basically, went against boycott, divestment, sanctions, went to Israel, made nods towards Zionism, was challenged rightly, I believe, by comrades within DSA. And what was the response of the organization that felt more fealty to Jamal Bowman than to the politics of Palestine? They shut down the BDS working group within the organization and silenced those voices of criticism. That is very troubling to me, and I really hope is not repeated. And I worry when I see Comrades in Jacobin, DSA, magazine, sort of making the argument that you were referring to just before, Robert, where we should shut the fuck up because we don't have enough power right now. So we're both in power, but we don't have power. I'm very confused by this. We're supposedly in power, but we don't have enough power to make demands on power. This is a contradiction in an argument. And frankly, I don't believe that the left has to wait to have some kind of power in order to make a legitimate critique. I mean, we didn't have any kind of power around Palestine when we started saying, decades ago, stop the occupation. And 20 years ago, boycott, divest, and sanction. And 2.5 years ago, stop the genocide. And yet we have moved the needle on popular consciousness and policy to a limited degree in this country around Israel. And I just think it's not, we don't wait for us to be up here for us to begin to voice criticisms. And I think this question of power, who has it, what does it mean for somebody that people support to win office, how do we position ourselves within that, is not something I think is a settled question on the left right now, because entirely too many people are believing as if we are operating from within the administration and need to be cautious in what we say and do so that we do not embarrass ourselves, aka this administration. That's a problematic dynamic for me.
Robert, did you want to say anything more about this?
I mean, I think it is, the contradiction when, your comrade gets elected. I don't want to pretend that Zohran is my personal comrade. I think my only interaction with him is, I think in 2021, when he was still a state senator, we had a kind of a march in Astoria to show solidarity between the Black Lives Matter movement and pro-Palestine movements. And one of the chants I was leading, the usual, if we don't get it, shut it down. But with my alternation of burn it down, I think Zohran had come over to me. He was like, hey, comrade, we probably shouldn't say burn it down, because the cops can use that against us. But I feel like I've been the annoying leftist in my workplace and social groups for so long that people do think I know Zohran, now that the socialist has been elected. But I think part of it is that, what I try to differentiate is the very just well-meaning people who are new to the political process, who have these expectations, of Zohran, as opposed to the people who've been arguing about what role socialists should play with the Democratic Party for a long time. And I think those people who've been around for a long time, who are pretty much saying, let's walk hand in hand with Zohran, let's not be one of his detractors in an attempt to hold him accountable, are in many ways setting up the younger, newer comrades for failure, right? Because even at my job in child welfare, I often say to my colleagues that the only real indication we have of the future is to look to the past. And if we do look to the past of mayoral administrations in the United States that have taken on populist rhetoric and have promised to deliver for the working class, the outcomes are not necessarily that positive. And as somebody who sees himself as part of the Black liberation movement, even though Zohran himself is not Black, I do think looking at the experiences of Black mayors in the in the United States is pretty helpful insofar as to get into power, they did have to kind of build this populist base, right? Like people like David Dinkins in New York City and Harold Washington in Chicago. To get the kind of turnout they needed, they did have to raise expectations of the masses that their election meant betterment for these people. However, the same questions of austerity haunted them then as they do haunt us now, that they themselves were forced to put austerity into place to please members of the coalition that they built. And it's much easier to put austerity in place against working class people as opposed to do this great thing of bucking the system and say, well, we're going to tax the rich, working class people have been hurting and suffering for too much. And the only real way that happens is if there's an active and organized movement to hold someone accountable for the promises they've made. And I think, as a member of the DSA, I cannot say I'm as committed to the electoral processes. But, I do get, for example, the dossiers that people fill out when they're seeking DSA's endorsement, and I'm generally familiar with that process. And we don't have anything in there to hold anyone accountable. It doesn't say, for example, that should you betray a promise you made to the DSA, then we will withdraw our endorsement or any such thing. We don't have an accountability mechanism. And the only real mechanism can be the increased struggle by masses of people for the demands to ensure they can live a healthy life and reproduce themselves and, be able to get a living wage. So I think in many ways, the masses of people who are hopeful in Zohran, they have to learn in many ways through their own experience. Because, I can say, well, I'm a socialist and I'm a revolutionary and I've studied theory, and based on my analysis, here's what's going to happen. But that might convince one or two people. But at the end of the day, I think people need to go through the experience of a Zohran administration to see what's going to happen. Currently, I don't know how to put it, but for example, in New York City DSA, there's current rules in place that if you as a sub-body of DSA, if you're the Afro-Socialist Caucus within New York City DSA or the Immigrant Justice Working Group, and you were to issue a public statement that is critical of one of the elected officials without using the official channels to try to convince this elected official to adopt your criticism, that you could lose sponsorship from the organization, your funding and these other things. So in many ways, it's structurally built in that, we will go hand in hand with Zohran towards power and we won't try to hold him accountable. But I think the wider working class hasn't signed up for that agreement. And if people feel those promises are being betrayed, there could be a sharp reaction from the working class. So it remains to be seen.
Right. So I want to pick up on something which Sherry mentioned briefly, although I'm not sure if you actually named the organization. But right after Mamdani's win, we saw the launch of this organization called Our Time, which I think is somewhat different than we've seen in the aftermath of some other kind of elections like this. So can you tell us a little bit about what Our Time is, who launched it, why they launched it, and how you've seen it operate, and any thoughts you might have about the problems of the organization?
Sure. Yes. Well, I'll start by saying that I'm probably more unconvinced at 60 than I was at 18 that the Democratic Party could ever be used as a tool for good by the left, and instead is more likely to use the left for its own nefarious purposes. But I really want to be in the trenches with other people as we grapple with the dilemmas and the contradictions of a social democratic mayor in the financial capital of a declining empire in a period of rising fascism and state terror, which is why I got involved in Our Time. I did not get involved in canvassing the campaign because I honestly just can't, for the life of me, stomach getting behind somebody who is running as a Democrat after 43 years. I just can't because I know that it will. I also worry about how it kind of rubs away at the brand of what is socialism by continuing to associate it with a party that is so hostile to our class. So consistently, even if this individual is not. So Our Time, I think, is trying to figure out what it is, to be honest, because people who are leading the discussion are sometimes talk about it one way and they sometimes talk about it another way. I didn't particularly care that at the meeting of 750, they didn't just say outright, this is a project of the Democratic Socialists of America, which would have been fine. They should have said it. And we are instituting a mass canvassing operation and nodes throughout the city from which we're going to fight to tax the rich and win, free childcare and, fast and free buses and all the rest. What they were saying is that we're not going to form a new organization because that would be redundant. And I was like, redundant with what? Where is there another broad left organization fighting for this? I didn't know. Is there too much left in New York? I wasn't aware that this would be redundant. And what I think they were trying to avoid was that this was a working group or an initiative of DSA. I don't know if they're continuing to do that, but that was how it was presented at its launch. Nonetheless, hundreds of people came out that very weekend and have since come out, and would be out today, but there's an enormous storm here in New York. It's snowing outside and like 0 degrees. But I think the operation is not run as a member-led organization where people come together to discuss the initiatives that are on that and how we're going to fight them, politically discuss the history of these things and learn how to move. It's basically what I see so far, and I'm hoping that this will shift. And it's one of the reasons I'm involved. I'm not actually interested in wasting time. I consider my time quite precious. Because I think that things can move and become something better than what they are, but you have to sort of be somewhat involved and more knowledgeable if you're going to have the street cred among the other people doing it, and B, really understand what the hell you're talking about and not just speak in abstractions. And right now what I see it as they're trying to superimpose the successful canvassing operation behind Mamdani and do it around the platform that of Mamdani. And I don't think that's the same thing as building an organization. An organization has to have some independence to the campaign itself, to the administration. It's not a campaign at this point, to the administration, and even if it's sharing certain goals, so they can actually have its own brain and develop its own mind and develop its own initiatives, even if it's going to work in concert with the administration at certain points, because sometimes it's invariably going to, for all the reasons that Robert just cited, of the austerity measures that will come down, it's going to have to also at times operate against what the administration is doing. Sometimes I would suggest in the interest of Mamdani the human, if not Mamdani the mayor. He's going to need a left, and that left actually has to have a brain of itself that's independent from the thinking of the strategists inside of City Hall. And that's not what's happening right now. And again, it's early stages, it's in the early weeks, but we're still being sort of summoned and mobilized. There's a difference between organizing and mobilizing, as all of us in this space know all too well, right? People are summoned to action via signal is not the same thing as people coming together to assess what have we then done and how do we improve on it and what might we do differently and how do we involve forces that are not yet organized into this. These are things that have to happen in actual movement spaces where strategy and tactics are debated, and that does not yet exist and doesn't seem to be yet on the agenda of some of the folks who are playing the leading role in our time. Again, it's early stages. Things can change. I don't know how set in stone this methodology is, but I do think that this is going to very quickly exhaust a number of people, because you can't just have canvassing in perpetuity for taxing the rich. That is, it's a component of what needs to happen. You have to get out there and talk to people, but in terms of strategy, tactics, education, developing leadership, and all the rest of that, this is not the means to do it. So far, I'm kind of disappointed with this initiative, but I want to stick with it because I want to see if there's ways of reshaping it and and having it become what it needs to be, a genuine movement organization of broader forces than are currently invested in it.
Any thoughts on our time, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, I could say very quickly, I think, the intent of our time is actually pretty noble, and it's something that we haven't seen before, right? I can't tell you, for example, the last time that we've had a politician come to power based on a canvassing campaign that we haven't seen in history. And then after he comes to power, the people behind it say, you know what, we're not breaking down the canvassing campaign. We're actually now going to orient it towards winning the affordability agenda. So if you go to the Our Time website, these are the calls to action they have, that you can send a letter to your elected representatives saying that, the importance to tax the rich and win free childcare, or you can go canvassing in a neighborhood near you with like-minded people to knock on doors and say, to your neighbors that you need to get involved in this political process. But as Sherry said, it doesn't really meet the criteria to get people organized and get them debating and see themselves as part of the forces that can make the world a better place. But nonetheless, it is unprecedented, at least in New York City history, that, when de Blasio came to power, and he's someone that, as I walked back and forth to work in Manhattan at the time, I would see him out there canvassing himself outside Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, trying to get people to vote for him. And once he came to power, I couldn't speak of any organization that he backed or that saw itself supporting him that went out and tried to engage people in the political process. But I think part of the problem is that our time is stuck in the same kind of canvassing modality, right? Like, I remember having a political debate with one of my comrades in the DSA about some of the shortcomings of electoralism. And pretty much they ended the debate by saying, I don't have time for this. I have doors to go knock. So in many ways, I think a lot of the criticisms that are being made of Zohran from the left are kind of being deflected in that way, and that you're being critical, but there's work to be done. The idea that there needs to be critical discussions to guide the direction of that work is not necessarily fully accepted as yet. I think people are still, in many ways, rightly reveling in Zohran's victory, especially given the national scenario under Trump, where the military and other forces are being mobilized against immigrants and our neighbors or friends. And there's been a general ratcheting up of American imperialism across the world as well. I think, people want time to settle and celebrate and in many ways give Zohran a chance. And if, our time is saying, well, we're here to continue the fight that began with the electoral campaign that saw Zohran win the primary and then win the general election, I think people are hopeful in that ways. And I think the reason our time isn't transitioning, right, from something that's like mobilization to organization is in many ways because like they are still doing that balance we talked about accountability and power in itself, just moving along with the administration and not trying to go against it.
So one of the things that I think is an obstacle for people on the left, especially outside the U.S., but also in the U.S., when it comes to accurately understanding Mamdani's win and the new administration, is the way that many people on the left in the U.S. talk about his election as a socialist win, that in their words would build working class power. You've already touched on this. And of course, here everything depends on what we mean by socialism and what we mean by building power. And I don't want to in any way diminish the political significance. You've talked about it really eloquently, about having a Muslim DSA member winning the mayoral election a year after Trump and the MAGA Republicans, won the presidency and took control of Congress. And I'm not diminishing the organizing and the mobilizing that went into making the win possible. And I don't want to downplay how good it would be if Mamdani's actually able to implement the reforms that he campaigned for, both for people living in New York City, but also for people elsewhere, because of the way expectations have been raised. And if this happened, if reforms are actually delivered, it would really, it would change people's perceptions about what might be possible. It's certainly very different from what's on offer from parties of the capitalist class. And outside of the U.S., what's on offer from parties of social democratic origin that have accepted neoliberalism, like the NDP in Canada and Labour in the UK. But again, you've touched on this already. The reality is that Mamdani is in office at the municipal level of the capitalist state in a really important city of global power. He's not in power. The working class is not in power in New York City. It's the capitalist class that's still the dominant class. And, at the best, he'll be able to deliver some reforms within capitalist society. But his election and what happens does change the terrain for building working class power in New York City. So any thoughts that you'd like to offer listeners about how you see the prospects for building working class power in New York City going forward with this new mayor in office?
Mamdani's opened a space and raised some expectations. Those are good things, or at least given people some room to breathe, or at least they feel that they can breathe more easily. And that's real. I mean, look, what's happening right now in Minnesota, to have a mayor of our city say, we don't want this nonsense coming, everybody in this country understands that the goal of the American ruling class was not to quell Minneapolis. Let us be honest with each other. Minneapolis is a testing ground for much larger and more racially diverse and immigrant-rich cities like New York, like Chicago, and what's playing out there is surely something that a lot of us are looking at with fear and horror could be coming our way, and also preparing ourselves on the ground, and having a mayor who is, going to unequivocally from jump say get the fuck out is certainly helpful, but that doesn't build the kind of power that we need. I do think that there is, what are the prospects? In large part, in some ways, the Mamdani angle of it is in opening up the spaces. The prospects are going to happen by what is actually going to happen on the ground in response to worsening conditions here. Will unions, now that words like strike and even general strike and shutting things down are out there. I'm not saying that there are big unions nationally or even in New York City taking up these things, but, I'm on a thread with a bunch of my members in my union who are going, what are we talking about? And when are we going to call a general? There are people, it's now part of the lexicon. So the fact that we're having this conversation and that he is in office in a moment of severe repression, without, the organized forces on the ground to meet that repression, but vast sentiment that is moving towards we need to do something and nobody's coming to save us, opens up possibilities for what could be built. We are so far from that right now because we really just don't have leadership that is coming from the ground. We talk about like how would somebody from let's think out loud here. How would somebody from the left be held accountable in office from the ground? We talk in large part about movements and things like that. The only experiment I'm even vaguely aware of where a leftist was elected to office in recent memory and even tried to be held accountable by movements on the ground was actually tried a few years ago in Philadelphia when a district attorney who came about, Richard Krasner. I've never met the man, but I know a lot of people who supported him, and they're leftists and they were part of the movement. And what they did when he was elected district attorney, which obviously is hardly a position of power that the left covets. This is, right? The people who often prosecute our side. What they had done for a number of months is that the various leftist forces, tenants union forces, unions, various left groups, including, I'm sure, DSA and other movement groups, immigrant rights groups, would literally meet with the mayor and his administration every few weeks in his office. This lasted about 3 or 4 months into administration until he could no longer, basically scrap that. But that was the only sort of experiment in trying to even have some sort of council. They called it like a kitchen cabinet of sorts that he built to have the actual movements on the ground talking with him, arguing with him, debating with him, talking about their priorities, talking about his priorities, challenging his initiatives and all the rest of that. There isn't even any kind of thinking about doing that right now. And I do think that that is the kind of thing. Because usually when movement forces and unions and NGOs go to left, social democrats in office, they go hat in hand. They kind of go, how can we support you? Not how do you give us what we need? And feel like any demands being placed on an official actually might jeopardize their finances or their position later on down the road. So a shift in even what we're demanding of our elected officials needs to happen. And I think that's not happening so much as a result of Mamdani, but really as a result of what's happening in the real world on the ground. And right now, it seems almost impossible not to talk about it in the terms of ICE. And what's happening in Minnesota. So I think, look, what would happen when they come? They're already here. ICE has never left New York. But what would happen if they start doing the kinds of things that we're seeing on broad scale, much deeper numbers than what we're already seeing in neighborhoods like Sunset Park and in Jackson Heights and the immigrant-rich neighborhoods of New York where they're already operating under a Mamdani administration? And how will the labor unions and broad left respond? Because right now, if you go online, there's this presumption that and what I'm hearing, the local police forces or the National Guard are somehow supposed to be our saviors against the ICE official, but obviously they're working, hand in glove with them. I mean, maybe they're not doing exactly the same things, but nobody in New York City, I have a hard time imagining black working class seeing the NYPD as somehow saviors against ICE. That seems laughable and insulting. And what position will Mamdani take in those regards? Will he see the police as something to rein in ICE? So I think the prospects are, in the short term, not good. In the medium term, perhaps better, because I do think the experience of, as Robert said, of seeing how elected officials operate when they're in these positions, and frankly, the stakes are so high here. We're talking about human life and basic, freedoms to even just go to the store. Are at stake. So the learning curve may not be a matter of years, but it could be a matter of months. But I don't see the response right now of we've got to get ourselves organized toot sweet so that we can confront this, coming from the union of the leadership and the leaders of the of working class forces in this town. What I'm seeing is rank and file members and lower level and the broad left trying to form, kind of a popular front network of organizations to keep ourselves safe, train ourselves, educate ourselves, and get ourselves organized into neighborhood signal groups right now. And that's a start, but that's a far cry from the kind of wielding of power to win taxing the rich and the programs, and also fighting off a federal government that is, militarizing their forces and coming into the cities. And so I think we've got some challenges ahead, and we're not yet positioned as a class to rise to those challenges. But there's certain ingredients that are in existence now, with having had the vast canvassing, having the beginnings of a group like Our Time, having the NYC Fight Back sort of network to form these sort of rapid response. These are beginnings, but they're not yet in a position to sort of exercise power. This is about just basic trying to defend ourselves and not get the shit kicked out of us.
Robert.
I'm sorry, I got a little lost listening to Sherry. What are we talking about again?
So no, just any thoughts you'd like to share about the prospects for building working class power in New York City with Mamdani in office?
Yeah, well, I think the prospects are much better now than they've been since I lived in the city since 2002, when I came here as an immigrant from Guyana, and pretty soon after, as the anti-Iraq war movement blossomed, and I became part of it and joined the left and became a socialist. There have been pockets of activity here and there to get involved in wider movements like Occupy Wall Street and the iterations of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think we're kind of now at the pinnacle of that all, right? The people I've known from all those times are thrown into this heady mix with people who are newly activated and consider themselves socialists. And I think the expectation that this person who we threw all this effort to elect and said he will do all these things just opens the door to have those conversations with people. And I think it is, for those of us who believe in the concept of developing cadre, a time to actually pick out the best and brightest amongst those people to say, that they can be leaders both in their workplace, in the streets, and in other places where the struggle is erupting. But the challenge is, of course, the federal government that is going in quite the opposite direction. And I think part of what we can do to broaden the horizons of those expectations and make it a reality is to kind of challenge Zohran to be, the kind of populist he imagines himself to be. Because, populism is supposed to be represented as a fighting movement, right? That we, the people, are wrestling back the power denied to us from the state and the establishment back into our hands. So I think, for example, one of the reasons we haven't seen as intense a reaction from ICE in New York City as we've seen in Minneapolis is a kind of detente between Zohran and President Trump. But more importantly, I think there is a level of self-activity and organization of the immigrant communities here in New York that, even though people are afraid to the extent that, I have coworkers who are naturalized citizens walking around with their passports just in case. In the few instances that ICE has been in New York and has been kidnapping immigrant New Yorkers, there's been a swift and rapid response from the communities here, even those that are not that politicized. It is also the case that Trump can overplay his hand. If you think back to his previous administration, where he wanted to, bring out the National Guard and bring out the military into the streets to quell the Black Lives Matter protests, he was actually stymied in doing that by the Joint Chief of Staff and other people in his own administration who kind of raised the peril of you might incite a civil war, because what if the people you bring out to fight against ordinary working class Americans end up siding with them? This is why I think when Trump built the BORTAC task force under his previous administration that cobbled together various officers from ICE and other federal agencies, it had more of a limited impact. Whereas now, he's openly building a Gestapo in ICE where they're hiring just anyone to come out and do this work of removing immigrants. And I think the way in which he is going about immigration enforcement, which is very different from the way the previous Democratic administrations have, is sending a chill of fear into the country because they're removing people internally as opposed to just turning them back at the border, which is how Obama and Biden achieved those record deportation numbers. But I think, there's also that possibility that people, could fight back in a way that's unprecedented, right? Both iterations of the Black Lives Matter movement, very few people saw them coming because they were just too much for people who were already suffering. And now that you see ICE is openly killing people and kidnapping people who themselves are American citizens, we could come to a conflagration. They say that revolution comes like a thief in the night, so you never know when something insurrectionary might happen. But it is the case that there's been at least a shift over the last decade in the United States of working class people's consciousness, where they are beginning to get a sense of themselves and the power and the fact that society runs off of their labor. And the things they do, and that conversely, they can withhold that labor and get into the streets and do things to grind society to a halt to win their demands. Obviously, I think the capitalist system is one that is so violently exploitative that the demands we win won't stay around for a long time. I think we're seeing that with the erasure of the diversity, equity, and inclusion reforms that were won in some ways and that are now being overturned by the Trump administration. But I think we should nonetheless be optimistic, right? That what has been seen as a sleeping giant, the American working classes, in fits and starts trying to wake up. And the Mamdani administration, in many ways, is both a reflection of that and in very sophisticated ways, also a barrier to it. But with the contradiction of, this win of a progressive in the biggest city in the country, while the most conservative and reactionary president we've seen for generations is there, things could end up being a tinderbox, kind of like we had in the run-up to COVID, where we kind of saw these triple crises of capitalism all coming to a head.
So I'd like to close with an argument that you've just touched on earlier. I know you disagree with, but I think it's worth taking on explicitly just to wrap us up, because it's an argument that gets made in other places as well as in New York, which is the argument you hear that goes something like this. Okay, unions have to negotiate with employers to win gains for workers, and so they face constraints in dealing with employers, like the competitive pressure that private companies are under, and in the public sector, the limited funds that employers have to pay workers, also true in the nonprofit sector. And so then the conclusion is workers can't win everything we want anytime that we want. And then they go on to say, okay, leftists like Mamdani who get elected into office face constraints. And so we have to accept that Mamdani has to negotiate with capitalists and make compromises in order to make incremental gains. And therefore, the task of radicals is to help Mamdani achieve those goals. After all, he's one of us, they would say. And if he can't achieve them, or if he can only partially achieve them, it's because we're not strong enough. And so, conclusion, if Mamdani disappoints, socialists should not criticize him or hold him accountable because it won't be his fault. So just to wrap us up, could you take that on directly?
Well, I mean, clearly I it won't be his fault, but he will be colluding with the enemy. I think that the question here is his victory, in my understanding, is inconceivable without there having been active mobilization on the ground. And I don't mean the canvassing. The canvassing was obviously instrumental in his, but in order to get millions of people to actually vote for this guy, there had to have been the preparing of ground of social movements prior to that. And I don't see a possibility of, DSA may be trying to, discipline its own comrades into what can be said and what cannot be said. But I have a hard time imagining a world in which people in New York City who are already living in an intolerable status quo are going to remain silent if somebody that they've elected into office doesn't deliver at least some of the goods, or at least defend them against the worst of the attacks coming from the right and alleviate some of the pain and suffering that people are experiencing right now. There's no chance of that. And we as socialists have a duty to help lead that charge into not just being a complaint, but how do we actually shift the power dynamic and move people from complaining or just mobilizing into actually organizing and strategizing. And frankly, I see the absence of strategic spaces for debate and discussion right now to be really a huge problem for us in New York and throughout the left in the United States. There's no place for us all to talk to each other. And I don't mean on social media where we scream at each other or entrench positions or have hot takes or things like that, but actually sitting around and strategize with people who are interested in trying to make change. So I don't know how else to respond to that and that, but I don't see a possibility of people remaining, silent in the face of a passive Mamdani. I don't see him being passive, or a Mamdani who colludes with aspects of what people perceive to be part of the system crushing them. People will turn against him as they have turned against others. As they should, but the question for me is not, the vehemence of the criticism verbally. It's what are we going to do, in order to actually instrumentalize, these criticisms and do something, to actually, move the needle, forward on bringing down the rent and making the city affordable and livable for more people. Because, I'm looking out at a window. It's somebody who's homeless living out there. It's 0 degrees out. There's a storm here. This is, I don't even live in a neighborhood where there's a particular huge amount of homelessness. There is a housing crisis here. There is a poverty crisis here. There is a racism crisis. There is so many crises going on here. Access to, healthcare, just, winnowing away. Mamdani is going to have to be able to show some palpable relief on some of these questions, and that he is doing, and that's not going to happen without some forces, and other people are not going to be disciplined to some comrade telling them to keep quiet because they don't want to embarrass somebody. People are going to criticize and people are going to organize. And I think right now people would like to organize with him, but people will just as easily go against him if at least some of these promises don't come to fruition.
Last word for you, Robert?
Yeah, I think, the ability of working class New Yorkers to organize themselves and actually build connections amongst each other and kind of break down the typical New Yorkers mind their own business and don't care about each other kind of like public persona that the city has is essential to survival, regardless of who the mayor is. But clearly our current mayor has raised expectations, right? That we can actually break down the kind of isolation and atomization that comes with capitalism, and to actually get to know our neighbors and to move into action with our neighbors towards common causes, whether it's something like, building tenants associations to fight back against the landlords, or building associations to alert our more vulnerable neighbors when ICE comes around. I think a talented organizer and the socialists would use the raised expectations of a Mamdani administration to have a conversation with people who may not have even entertained that conversation before, whether it's in their workplace or another social setting. The idea that the constraints on the administration are inevitable in the same way that constraints on the leadership of a union is inevitable. It's actually true, but there is a horizon of possibility beyond those constraints that is based in the fact that those constraints can be loosened by the class struggle, right? By people actually getting together in their numbers and fighting with each other towards very specific demands, which in the course of struggle tends to show people that, you know, there's common cause with a wider group of people. And it's not just childcare or transportation that's the issue, but the wider system. And I think the question is, how does a Mamdani administration respond to such a thing? I think ideally, if Zohran was really the real deal, it wouldn't be a question of him endorse. For example, like, you know, nurses in New York City recently went on strike at the privatized hospitals. And I'm sure Zohran has been supportive of it, but has he really called for New York City's working class to also shut things down in support of those nurses, right? Has he challenged the leaders of the unions that endorsed him in both the primary and the general election to have their workers come out to these picket lines in support of the nurses? And I think, you know, this is a general thing that we will face, right? That it's one thing for Bernie and Zohran and others to cheerlead various struggles, but will there be a point where they actually try to lead some struggles, right? Where they could use the infrastructure for our time and the previous canvassing operation to say, you know, this is enough. We've had it. Turn out in your numbers. Recently, in solidarity with the general strike in Minnesota, there was a ICE out of New York demonstration on Friday that was pretty well attended. And one of the organizations that endorsed it was my union, DC 37, which was refreshing to see. But they kind of endorsed it in the same way that they endorsed Zohran. It was like, well, the political tide is here. We kind of have to. So we found out about the endorsement when we got an email the day before saying, come out to the rally. So will it be this kind of minimal rubber stamping thing, or will there be an actual mobilization and encouragement that people use the power that they have? And I think that's the danger, right? Because that power that we have could in many ways sweep away a Mamdani administration.
Yep.
Robert Cuffy and Sherry Wolf, thank you so much for this discussion.
Thank you, Dave. And thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Sherry and David. Nice to speak with you.
Stay warm.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.